Let's bring in three members of Parliament now to discuss some of the key stories today. And Arif Virani is an Ontario Liberal MP. James Bezan is a Manitoba Conservative MP and the Deputy Opposition Whip for the official opposition. And Rachel Blaney is a British Columbia New Democrat MP and the Whip for the NDP. Good to see you all. Let's start with the virtual sittings, Mr. Virani. A return to hybrid sittings. We're being told that it will be a priority to have ministers in the chamber and the Prime Minister as well, but other MPs will be limited in numbers to allow for distancing. Why are hybrid sittings still necessary for Parliament?
Well, I think because we're trying to be realistic with the competing objectives of ensuring Parliament can function and parliamentarians can do their work, but also with the competing objective of observing public health guidelines. We know that we're not in the same place in the pandemic that we were obviously 18 months ago, but the pandemic is still with us. There are still concerns about fourth and fifth waves. People are contracting the virus. There was a member of the Conservative caucus who himself contracted the virus just this past week. We want to be able to ensure that if that happens to me, to James, to Rachel, or to any of us, that you're still able to do your work as a parliamentarian by participating virtually and still carrying that voice of your constituents into the House of Commons, but through a hybrid format.
Mr. Bezan, would your argument that the House is safe and meeting according to the rules, would that argument be bolstered if Conservatives would tell everyone in Parliament how many of their MPs are vaccinated, how many are not, some who have exemptions? What is that number? And is it right to force MPs who may have compromised immune systems to attend in person?
We're following the public health guidelines just like everybody else, and this decisions that were made by independent medical experts. We're following the guidelines from the Parliament health nurse. Everybody has met those guidelines to be in the House. And, you know, shutting down Parliament to go virtual so the Liberals can play games like we witnessed in the last Parliament where they can, you know, filibuster and suspend committee meetings at end and never get down to the business of the day and continue on with their cover-ups. Isn't what we were just elected to do. You know, we were out knocking doors, canvassing our constituents, and they all elected us to have our butts in seats and standing up for their values and standing up for the issues that are of concern to them back home. So if we're going to be able to talk about all this stuff, it's important that everybody is in the chamber. Now, if somebody does get COVID, and that's possible, and we witnessed that last week when one of our vaccinated MPs actually did get sick, guess what? We can do pairing where we don't have to have everybody in the House and people can actually go back. We want people to get better. We want them to recover, and we've done it in the past when people have had
but doesn't this avoid pairing? So if you've got an MP who gets sick and has to self-isolate, they can still take part in Parliament virtually. You don't have to pair.
This only fulfills the narrative that the Liberals who want to do cover-ups and the NDP who want to stay home and not work. You know, I think we need to make sure that the institution and democracy here in Canada is protected. And the only way we can do that is that members are in the House doing their job.
Let me hear Rachel Blaney. What's your response to that argument?
Well, I think it's really disappointing to hear a Conservative member, first of all, not indicate how many of their members are unvaccinated, and number two, make implications about any other party and the dedication that they have to this country. I believe that all parties, regardless of partisanship, are dedicated to serving their constituents, and I just want to make sure that's on the record. The reality is, when I go out into the world and do things, right now you need to show proof of vaccination to walk into the room. That's how we know we're safe. Everything that you do when you stand up and walk around, you make sure that you're wearing a mask. Right now, we're sitting in a and actually our public health has actually said to us the members of Parliament should keep a mask on at all times, even when speaking in the House, which is something that we are all not doing. So we have to look at this. And the other part is we are responsible as parliamentarians, not only for our members, but for the people who work for us in this building. And so when we think of all the buildings of Parliament, how they could potentially be impacted, how children under 11 who cannot be vaccinated could be impacted, that's for people who work here who have to go home, to immunocompromised loved ones, to children under 11, and MPs. This is about public health and public safety. It is not about partisanship, but it certainly is about the lack of honesty from the Conservative Party.
Well, that's where we're headed to virtual sitting, so we'll keep an eye on a hybrid Parliament. Mr. Virani, let me shift now to talk about the economy and more specifically the issue of inflation. What can be done about the steep rise in prices that Canadians are facing for staples? There are clearly global drivers, but the billions of dollars in government supports during the pandemic, a lot of economists say, has pushed up consumer demand. So at this point, what responsibility does your government have for dealing with rising inflation and how to do that?
Well, it is clearly a global phenomenon. We've seen that. We've seen statistics thrown around, but it is clearly a global phenomenon of which Canada is a part. But the second major point is that what we are doing and what we heard during the campaign trail and what we put in our platform and in the speech from the throne is efforts that will render life more affordable for Canadians. And the two primary features there are childcare agreements that will bring childcare costs down to $10 a day within 4 or 5 years, starting with halving the price by next year with nine provinces and territories so far. And secondly, with making housing more affordable. And that's rental housing, that's renting to own, that's making closing costs on the real estate transaction more affordable as well. Those are
so is it your view that this is
more money?
Is it your view that this is a short-term tough patch, not necessarily short-term, but this is not this will not be with us forever, and that you think Canadians will come through it in part with the support of government policies?
It very much is my view, and it's not just my view, it's also the view of Tiff Macklem, who said that we are in a transitionary period. This is something that's affecting all nations, all westernized nations, capital markets, et cetera, and it's affected by global supply chains, et cetera, and it is something that we are weathering the same way that other nations are weathering. We are weathering it better than our southern neighbor, but marginally less well than some of our European neighbors.
Mr. Bezan, let me hear you on this. If the pandemic spending by the government is at least in part responsible for increasing inflation, would your party have spent less money with a view to keeping inflation under control as the pandemic started to wane?
We know that the money presses have been running overtime in the government of Canada. We know that the increase in dollars that are in circulation is driving a homemade, right here in Canada, inflation crisis. We know that's the same situation south of the border as well, that there's just too many dollars in circulation. And that causes people to have more to spend, and of course they're going to inflate the prices. In the G7, we are second overall. And in the world, when it comes down to looking at housing prices, we are second in the world for the highest inflation on housing at 6.7%. So it really does speak to the issue that the government policies that we have in here in Canada is creating a lot of this inflation. We know that as commodity prices are increasing and as we're looking at global supply chain issues and all those things that are impacting upon Canada and the rest of the world, when the Canadian dollar gets weaker because of too many dollars in circulation, the price of all those goods and services go up.
Rachel Blaney, what role should the federal government play in dealing with inflation? What would your solutions be?
Well, this is very concerning, and we're seeing a lot of folks that are, in serious risk of not having a home. I think of the seniors across this country, the ones that were working seniors who received the guaranteed income supplement, that is now, over 80,000 seniors have been told, sorry, you won't be getting your guaranteed income supplement, even though you were working, you were eligible for the program. So you look at with the decision making that we're seeing in this government. So instead of looking at the bigger corporations that made significant profit in some cases during the pandemic, making sure that they're getting taxed appropriately so that we're seeing the resources there to stabilize what we're seeing in the more vulnerable populations across Canada, it's concerning that decision-making process isn't happening. And we do need to deal with this. I think of North Island, part of my riding, where housing costs have gone up by 55%. There needs to be action taken so that there's more affordability for those folks that need it.
These are challenges for Canadians in all parts of the country. And thank you all. Our time's short tonight, but thank you all for your input and joining me for this conversation. Good to see you all again. Take care. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.